The village lay in the middle of a vast valley, surrounded by dry, dusty hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. Homes were simple, mostly built from mud and stones, and the narrow paths that twisted between them were filled with children playing, women carrying water and elders sitting outside their homes, staring at the sky as if waiting for a miracle. Life here had always been hard, but the past few years had made it almost unbearable. Disease, hunger, and small skirmishes from nearby conflicts had left the people exhausted, tired, and deeply worried. Every day seemed to blend into the next, each one carrying more challenges than the last. Among the villagers there was a sense of quiet desperation. Parents worried about their children. Young men tried to find work in nearby towns but often returned empty-handed. And every evening as the sun dipped behind the hills, the village felt lonelier, as if hope itself was hiding behind the mountains. But today was different. Word had spread that aid was coming, real help, medical teams with doctors, medicine, and supplies that could finally reach the people who had been waiting for years. The news brought a strange energy to the village. For the first time in a long while, people moved faster. Smiles appeared on tired faces and conversations hummed with excitement. Mothers spoke softly to their children about the doctors who would help them. Elders whispered prayers of thanks. Even the children, usually restless and curious, stayed unusually calm, sensing something big was about to happen. In the middle of the village, near a small square lined with olive trees, a young volunteer doctor arrived first. She had spent years helping communities like this one, but the conditions here were worse than she had ever seen. She had seen malnutrition, injuries, and sickness before, but the emptiness in the eyes of the villagers felt different. It was the emptiness of long-term neglect, of people who had almost stopped believing that someone, anyone, would come to help them. She began organizing a space for the incoming aid, clearing the ground and setting up temporary shelters with the help of a few local volunteers. They placed blankets for the sick, buckets of water for hygiene, and small tents that could serve as treatment rooms. As she worked, villagers gathered around her, curious, asking questions and sharing their worries. "Will they help with the children?" A mother asked, holding a small boy with a fever. Her voice trembled, not just from worry, but from the weight of years of waiting. "They will," the doctor said, smiling gently, though inside she hoped it was true. "They've brought medicine for everyone who needs it." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky and the village buzzed with anticipation. Finally, a distant sound broke the air, a rhythmic hum that grew louder with every passing second. The villagers looked toward the horizon, shielding their eyes from the sun, and slowly a convoy appeared. Trucks and vehicles, all perfectly lined up, approached the village. But these were not the vehicles they had expected. They were larger, stronger, almost intimidating in their size and shape. The villagers whispered to each other nervously. "Are these the doctors?" one asked. Another shook his head, uncertain. The young doctor's heart skipped a beat as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. This didn't look like a typical aid convoy. The vehicles were equipped in a way she had never seen before. Armor plates, reinforced frames, and strange markings that hinted at precision and discipline. Then, as the convoy stopped at the village square, the doors opened. At first, the villagers expected ordinary doctors to step out, smiling and carrying supplies. But what emerged was far from ordinary. Tall, strong humans in perfectly fitted suits, moving in complete synchronization, came out of the vehicles. They did not carry medical kits in the traditional sense. Instead, they had equipment that seemed part machine, part human, almost like a hybrid of soldier and medic. The young doctor felt her stomach tighten. Something was off, though she could not immediately place it. The villagers stared in awe and confusion. Children hid behind their mothers, peeking curiously at these beings who seemed more like warriors than healers. An old man whispered to himself, "These are no ordinary people." The leader of the group, a tall figure with calm but piercing eyes, walked forward. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. He gestured to the crowd not with words but in a way that demanded attention and respect. Villagers instinctively fell silent, waiting, watching, unsure of what to do. Then, in a soft but firm voice, the young doctor addressed the group, hoping to break the tension. "We are waiting for medical help. Are you here to treat the sick?" The tall figure nodded once, sharply, and immediately, the rest of the group began organizing themselves. They did not speak as a team would. Instead, they moved in perfect unison, forming lines, carrying equipment in ways that no ordinary human could. Their presence alone seemed to command the space, reshaping the village square without a single spoken order. At first, the villagers were mesmerized. They had never seen humans move with such precision and purpose, but slowly, a sense of unease began to creep in. This was not the gentle, comforting presence they had expected. These beings were powerful, almost too powerful. Their eyes scanned the crowd, noticing every movement, every shift in posture. It was as if they were aware of everything before it happened. Despite the tension, the young doctor reminded herself of why they had come. They had the tools, the skills, and the mission to heal. She watched as the group began unloading large boxes of supplies. But the way they handled the boxes was startling. They moved them effortlessly as if weight meant nothing. And every action was precise to a degree that was almost unnatural. A few villagers stepped closer, curious, trying to see what was inside. The young doctor encouraged them, showing them the blankets, the medicine, and the bandages. Slowly, the initial fear began to mix with wonder. The supplies were real, the promise of help tangible. But then the leader of the group walked to the edge of the square and raised his hand. In an instant, the villagers froze. It was not a command in words, but in presence. Everyone stopped what they were doing, watching as he scanned the area. Even the children, who had been quietly exploring, felt the weight of his gaze. The young doctor realized that these beings were not just here to help. They were here to control, to maintain order, and to ensure that nothing interfered with their mission. The sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the village. The villagers had mixed feelings now. Relief that help had arrived, but also a creeping fear they did not understand. They had expected simple doctors with medicine and gentle hands. Instead, they got something entirely different. Humans who seemed capable of both incredible healing and extraordinary power. By the end of the day, the village was ready for treatment. Tents were set up, supplies were distributed, and a sense of hope returned. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken question. Who were these people really, and what exactly were they capable of? The young doctor stood in the middle of the square, watching the human battleships as they began their work. Her heart was heavy with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The village would be healed, that much was clear. But at what cost? And how would they all feel when they realized that the aid they had been waiting for came in a form they could not have imagined? As night fell, the villagers went to their homes, whispering to each other about the day's events. Some prayed for safety. Some marveled at the strange power they had witnessed, and some simply could not sleep, their minds racing with questions about these human battleships who had arrived in their village. The young doctor stayed awake longer than anyone else, reflecting on what she had seen. She knew this was only the beginning, because what had arrived today was not just aid. It was something much more complicated, something powerful, and something that would change the village forever. And as the stars appeared over the dusty hills, there was a quiet understanding. Tomorrow, life here would be different, in ways that no one could yet fully comprehend. The next morning, the village awoke to a quiet unlike any other. Normally, mornings were full of the sounds of chickens, children's laughter, and women calling to one another. Today, however, there was only a soft rustle of wind through the dry grass and the faint hum of movement from the square. People peeked from their doors and windows, curious but hesitant. The human battleships had been active since before sunrise, moving with a precision that made the villagers hold their breath. The young doctor walked toward the square, her mind filled with questions. Yesterday had been strange enough, but today promised answers, or at least more understanding. As she arrived, she saw the human battleships standing in neat formations, almost like statues, yet ready to spring into action at any moment. The villagers gathered at a safe distance, whispering to each other, unsure whether to be afraid or hopeful. One of the battleships began moving among the tents, checking the medical supplies. It lifted heavy boxes as if they weighed nothing, placing them neatly and efficiently. The villagers were impressed, but a cold feeling ran down their spines. There was no warmth, no smile, no conversation, only silent, powerful movement. The young doctor approached one of the battleships. "Can you tell us what you are exactly?" she asked softly. "We were expecting doctors, not this." The battleship paused and turned its head slightly toward her, almost acknowledging her presence. Then, without words, it gestured for her to watch. At first she did not understand, but then she saw it in action. A small child had fallen and scraped her knee badly. Instinctively, the doctor moved forward, but the battleship reached the child first. In an instant, the wound was cleaned, disinfected, and bandaged faster than any human hand could manage. The child barely cried, and the mother looked on, both relieved and shocked. Other villagers started noticing similar acts. The battleships moved among the sick and injured, treating wounds, giving medicines, and even comforting the frightened. But their movements were so precise, so mechanical, that it felt more like watching a machine than a human. Every action was controlled, efficient, and perfect. Yet, as amazing as this seemed, there was a shadow in the villagers' minds. These were not ordinary healers. They were strong, unnervingly calm, and clearly capable of more than just treating people. Some villagers whispered that they had seen them lift heavier boxes than any human could manage, move faster than any man, and organize the entire village in ways that seemed almost unnatural. The young doctor walked through the village, observing reactions. Some children clung to their mothers, afraid of the unfamiliar figures. Some adults watched with wide eyes, torn between awe and fear. She realized that this was not just about medicine. This was about control, power, and presence. Later in the morning, the first real test of their abilities arrived. A group of villagers had gone to gather water from a nearby well when they encountered a few armed raiders from outside the village. Normally, such a confrontation would cause panic, perhaps even violence. But today, the human battleships reacted instantly. Within moments, they positioned themselves between the raiders and the villagers. The raiders, confused and unprepared for such a display, froze. The battleships did not speak. They moved with a silent authority, blocking every possible threat. In less than a minute, the raiders retreated, leaving the villagers unharmed. The villagers watched in awe. Some whispered that they had just seen a miracle, while others shivered at the raw power that had just been displayed. The young doctor realized that these beings were not just healers, they were protectors, but in a way that carried an unspoken warning. They could destroy if necessary. After the incident, the villagers began to gather more closely around the square, observing how the battleships worked. They noticed how the healers used their strength to carry patients quickly to the tents, how they could lift heavy stones or debris out of the way, and how they could even support broken bones with unusual tools that seemed almost alive. Every action was precise, calculated, and effective. The young doctor couldn't help but marvel at their skill. In her experience, medical aid was always slow, often chaotic, and sometimes limited by human fatigue or fear. But these battleships had no such limitations. They worked without pause, without error, and with an almost frightening efficiency. By midday, the village had begun to heal. Children with fevers were calmer, wounds were treated, and even the elders who had been suffering from chronic illnesses were showing signs of improvement. The villagers began to talk quietly among themselves, sharing relief and admiration for the strange visitors. But beneath the gratitude, there was a lingering unease. The human battleships did not smile, they did not speak casually, and they did not rest. Their presence was both a blessing and a reminder that the village was now under their watchful eyes. Some villagers began to notice small things, the way the battleship's eyes seemed to track every movement, the way they could predict actions before they happened, and the way even small children seemed to instinctively obey without understanding why. The young doctor felt conflicted. On one hand, the help was real, effective, and transformative. On the other, she could not shake the feeling that this was more than aid. These were humans with power beyond ordinary understanding, and she could not tell whether their intentions were purely good. In the afternoon, one of the battleships approached her again. This time it carried a small child who had been seriously injured. The child's mother followed, trembling and anxious. The battleship's hands were steady and strong as it carefully examined the child. The doctor watched closely, seeing techniques that were far beyond anything she had learned. Bones were realigned in seconds, wounds cleaned with precision, and the child was calm almost instantly. The mother wept quietly, a mixture of relief and fear in her eyes. She hugged her child tightly, thanking the battleship silently. The young doctor stood beside her, realizing that the villagers' gratitude was matched by a growing fear. These beings could save lives, yes, but their presence reminded everyone that power could be both protective and terrifying. As evening approached, the village square began to empty, though not completely. Some villagers stayed to observe the battleships at work, learning their routines and trying to understand their mysterious ways. The young doctor walked through the tents, checking on patients and quietly reflecting. She realized that this day would not be forgotten. The memory of human strength combined with human care would linger in the village for years. Night fell over the valley, painting the sky with stars. The battleship stood quietly, almost like guardians watching over a sleeping village. The villagers returned to their homes carrying stories of the day's miracles, but also stories of fear and wonder. They had expected simple medical aid, but instead, they had witnessed humans who were capable of extraordinary power, healing, and control. The young doctor stayed awake longer than most, thinking about what she had seen. She knew this was only the beginning. There was more to these human battleships than anyone yet understood. She also realized that the villagers' perception of help had changed forever. Aid was no longer just medicine. It was something far greater and far more complex. She looked up at the sky, feeling a mixture of awe, fear, and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and perhaps new revelations about the beings who had come to heal them. But for tonight, the village rested, safe under the silent watch of human battleships, who were far more than anyone could have imagined. And somewhere deep inside, the young doctor knew that this was a story the villagers would tell for generations, a story of hope, fear, and the strange, unforgettable day when humans arrived to heal them. And in doing so, revealed a power beyond understanding. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of dust and dry grass across the village. After the events of the previous day, the villagers moved more cautiously. Their excitement over the arrival of aid was tempered by a quiet unease. The human battleships had shown them a new kind of power, one that could save lives. Yes, but also one that made everyone feel small, almost fragile. The young doctor walked through the village square, observing the battleships as they worked. They moved among the tents and patients silently, as if the world itself had slowed down around them. Every action they took was perfect, precise, and deliberate. A broken arm was set in moments, a fever treated with a single application of a strange device, and even the most frightened children were calm in their presence. It was during this calm that the first test arrived. A group of armed outsiders appeared on the outskirts of the village. They were scavengers from nearby regions, desperate and dangerous, looking for food, supplies, or anything they could take. Normally, the villagers would have panicked, some hiding, others trying to negotiate. But today, the battleships reacted before anyone even noticed the threat. The young doctor watched as the largest of the human battleships moved toward the outsiders. Without a word, it positioned itself between the villagers and the approaching danger. Its stance was unyielding, calm, and unshakable. The outsiders froze, not expecting such a response. They had seen humans before, yes, but never like this. Then, almost like a demonstration of invisible force, the battleship raised its arm. The outsiders hesitated, their weapons trembling in their hands. They tried to step forward, but it was as if an invisible barrier pushed them back. The villagers gasped. Some whispered prayers. Children clutched their mothers' skirts wide-eyed, unsure whether to be terrified or amazed. The battleships did not strike. They did not shout. Their presence alone was enough. The outsiders looked at each other nervously, realizing that whatever these beings were, they were far stronger than anyone had expected. In less than a minute, the group turned and fled, leaving the villagers unharmed. The young doctor felt a strange mix of relief and fear. On one hand, the village had been protected without a single injury. On the other hand, she realized the true scale of the battleship's power. They could heal, yes, but they could also control, dominate, and defend with a force that no ordinary human could match. After the outsiders left, the villagers slowly came out of hiding. They approached the battleships cautiously, touching the ground near them, observing their movements, and whispering among themselves. Some were filled with gratitude, some with awe, and some with fear. The village had been saved, but the reality of the battleship's abilities left an unspoken question hanging in the air. Were they protectors, or were they something more? The human battleships returned to their work as if nothing had happened. They carried supplies, treated the sick, and moved with the same silent precision as before. But now the villagers watched with a new understanding. These beings were more than healers. They were guardians with power that could not be ignored. The young doctor moved through the tents, checking on patients and speaking quietly to the villagers. "They are here to help us," she said softly. "But they are," different. We must learn to understand them even as we rely on them." Her words were calm, but inside, she felt the tension in the air, the unspoken fear that lingered behind every awe-filled glance. By midday, the village had returned to a sense of normalcy. Children played quietly, elders sat outside their homes, and mothers tended to their families. Yet there was a noticeable change. People moved more carefully, aware that the battleships were always watching. Even in the midst of healing, the presence of such power had shifted the dynamics of the village. Gratitude was mixed with caution, trust with unease. The young doctor reflected on what she had seen. Medicine alone could not explain the human battleships. Their abilities went beyond healing. They were capable of strength, speed, and precision that defied human limits. They could protect, but their methods were unfamiliar, almost intimidating. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the hills, the battleships paused, standing silently in the square. The villagers gathered around, watching, learning, and waiting. The young doctor realized that this moment was important, not just for the healing they had brought, but for the lessons the village would carry forward. For the first time, the villagers began to understand the dual nature of the battleships. They were healers, yes, but also warriors. They brought safety, but their safety came with a presence that could not be ignored, a reminder that power could protect and intimidate at the same time. The day ended quietly, with the battleships retreating to their tents for the night. The villagers returned to their homes, sharing stories of what they had witnessed. They spoke in whispers, describing the strength, the speed, and the precision of the battleships. Some were amazed, some were frightened, and some simply could not find the words. The young doctor stayed awake, walking through the village and observing the people as they settled in for the night. She knew that this was only the beginning. The battleship's presence would continue to change the village, shaping the way people thought about aid, power, and protection. As the stars appeared in the sky, the village was quiet yet alive with a new awareness. They had expected medicine, healing, and help. Instead, they had witnessed something far greater, humans who could protect, heal, and command in ways they could barely understand. And the young doctor knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and perhaps new revelations about the human battleships who had arrived in their lives. The village would never be the same again, and the story of this day would be told for generations, about the day they expected medical aid and instead received guardians of unimaginable power. The morning sun rose slowly over the village, casting long shadows across the dusty paths and the small stone houses. The villagers moved quietly, carrying on their daily routines, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air. The human battleships had already begun their work for the day, moving with calm precision among the tents and the sick. Their presence had become a constant, almost like the rhythm of the sun itself, and the villagers couldn't help but notice it. The young doctor walked through the square, watching carefully. She could see the mixture of emotions in the villagers' faces: hope, relief, awe, and something more subtle, something almost like fear. Even as people began to feel better under the care of the battleships, there was a tension that couldn't be ignored. The battleships healed with speed and accuracy unlike anything the doctor had ever seen. Broken bones were set in minutes, fevers treated instantly, and even chronic pain seemed to vanish under their touch. But their methods were unusual. The healing did not involve gentle hands or comforting words. Every movement was deliberate and precise, almost mechanical. The villagers noticed this, and some whispered among themselves, "They are strong, and they are careful. But why do they seem so different?" A mother brought her small child, who had been sick for weeks, to the nearest tent. The child's eyes were tired, and the mother's voice trembled as she explained the symptoms. One of the battleships lifted the child effortlessly, examining them with tools that the villagers had never seen before. The young doctor watched closely, trying to understand the methods. Within moments, the child was calm, the fever reduced, and the mother wept quietly, half in relief and half in awe. Other villagers began to notice a pattern. Every time someone was treated, the result was perfect, almost instant. Children who had trouble walking now moved freely. Adults who had been weak with illness seemed to regain strength they had lost long ago. The village was healing at a pace no one had thought possible. Yet the villagers were not completely at ease. They began to realize that while the battleships healed their bodies, they also demanded attention and control. Patients were carried without asking, instructions were given without explanation, and even small movements of children were corrected, as if the battleships could see every detail of the world at once. The village was becoming healthier, yes, but it was also becoming dependent. The young doctor noticed this as she moved between the tents. She saw villagers waiting for guidance before doing simple tasks, even after the battleships were treating someone else. There was no anger or harshness in the battleship's behavior, but there was a subtle authority that was impossible to ignore. People followed their instructions automatically, as if the presence of these humans carried its own kind of force. By midday, the village square had changed completely. Tents were neatly arranged, supplies organized perfectly, and patients were being treated systematically. The battleships worked without pause, moving from person to person, lifting the sick with ease and performing complex treatments that seemed impossible. Villagers watched in awe, some feeling comforted, others uneasy. The young doctor approached one of the battleships. "How do you do it?" she asked softly. "How do you heal so quickly and perfectly?" The battleship looked at her, its expression calm and unreadable. Instead of answering with words, it gestured for her to observe. The doctor watched as it treated another patient, using a combination of strength, skill, and technology that seemed almost alive. The patient's pain eased in moments, and their injuries healed far faster than humanly possible. As the afternoon passed, more villagers began to notice the pattern. The battleships could do things no ordinary doctor could. They could lift people far heavier than anyone should be able to lift. They could move faster than anyone could follow, and their precision in treating wounds, setting bones, and even administering medicine was flawless. But the villagers also noticed that their own decisions were becoming less important. They waited for the battleships to guide them. Children looked to them for permission to play. Adults asked for their instructions before performing even simple tasks. Slowly, the village was being reshaped, not just healed but organized and controlled in a way that no one had anticipated. The young doctor felt a growing unease. She understood the value of what was happening. The village was being saved, lives were being restored, but she also saw the cost. The villagers' independence, their own instincts, and even their courage were quietly being replaced by reliance on the battleships. The doctor realized that this was not just about healing bodies. It was about influence, control, and power. A boy with a severe leg injury approached the doctor looking confused and afraid. The battleship who had been treating him earlier gestured for him to come closer. The boy hesitated, and the young doctor noticed the fear in his eyes. "It's okay," she said softly. "They will help you, but you don't have to be afraid." The boy nodded slowly, and the battleship carefully lifted him, examining the leg with precision. In moments, the injury was treated, and the boy could stand and walk. The villagers cheered softly, but the doctor noticed the subtle tension in their faces. Relief was mixed with uncertainty. They were grateful, but they also understood, at some deep level, that this kind of help came with expectations and boundaries that they could not fully see. As the day ended, the battleships began to gather in the square, standing silently as the villagers returned to their homes. The village was clean, organized, and healthier than it had been in years. Children played with newfound energy, and adults moved through the streets with strength they had not felt in a long time. But the young doctor could not shake the feeling that something important was changing. The village had been saved, yes, but at the cost of something less visible: freedom, spontaneity, and the natural rhythm of life. The battleships had brought healing, but they had also brought an unspoken power that the villagers now depended on. That night, the doctor walked through the quiet streets, observing the villagers as they prepared for sleep. Some whispered prayers of thanks. Some told stories of the miraculous treatments they had received. Others sat quietly staring into the darkness, unsure how to feel about the beings who had changed their lives so completely. She paused at the edge of the square, looking at the tents where the battleships rested. They had done incredible things today, saved lives and given hope to the village. But the doctor knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The villagers were growing stronger physically, but their reliance on the battleships was also growing. And with that reliance came questions. Questions about freedom, control, and the cost of such perfect healing. The doctor sighed quietly, looking up at the stars. She knew that the village would never be the same again. The battleships had changed more than their bodies. They had changed the way people thought, acted, and depended on each other. And somewhere deep inside, she wondered if the cost of such power would become clear, only when it was too late to step back. For now, the village slept quietly and uneasily, under the watchful eyes of the human battleships. The day had been filled with healing, hope, and wonder, but it had also left a lingering sense of tension, a reminder that power, no matter how helpful, always comes with responsibility, and sometimes with fear. And the young doctor knew that tomorrow, the village would face new challenges, new questions, and perhaps new tests of the human battleship's incredible abilities. For now, though, they rested, grateful for what had been given, and unsure of what the future held under the silent guardianship of these extraordinary beings. The morning was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The villagers moved carefully through the streets, still in awe of what had happened over the past few days. The human battleships were already at work, moving with calm precision among the tents, checking supplies and tending to the sick. But today felt different. There was an air of tension that had not been there before, a sense that something important was about to happen. The young doctor walked through the village, observing both the battleships and the villagers. She noticed subtle changes in behavior. People no longer moved freely. They waited for guidance, unsure if a wrong step might draw attention. Even small children looked to the battleships for permission to play. Relief and gratitude were still there, but they were mixed with hesitation and fear. It was late morning when the first real challenge appeared. A dispute had broken out among some villagers near the outskirts of the square. Two men had argued over food that had been distributed, and their voices had grown loud enough to draw a small crowd. Normally, such a quarrel might have been settled by words or perhaps by intervention from elders. But today, the human battleships noticed immediately. One of the battleships moved toward the crowd, its movements smooth and deliberate. The villagers fell silent, instinctively stepping back. The young doctor approached concerned. She knew that the battleship's goal was protection and healing, but she also sensed that their methods might be harsher than human intuition could predict. The battleship raised its hand, signaling the two men to stop. They froze, unsure of what to do. The human presence was commanding, but it was not gentle. The young doctor tried to speak, but the battleship turned its gaze toward her, and she felt an unspoken warning. Do not interfere. The leader of the group stepped forward, examining the quarrel. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, but the villagers felt the weight of his authority. Without a word, he intervened. The two men were separated, and the disputes were resolved in moments. The young doctor noticed how efficient and precise the intervention was, but she also saw the fear in the villagers' eyes. They had not simply been helped, they had been controlled. Later that afternoon, another test came, and it was far more serious. A small boy had wandered too close to a construction area where debris had fallen. He had gotten trapped under a large piece of wood. Panic spread quickly. Villagers rushed forward, but before anyone could act, a battleship reached the boy, lifting the debris effortlessly. In moments, the boy was safe. The villagers cheered, but the young doctor could see the tension on their faces. Relief was mixed with awe, and awe with fear. As the day continued, the young doctor began to notice a pattern. The battleships could save lives, stop conflicts, and enforce order, but their power was absolute. There was no room for error, no space for independent thought, and no negotiation. Their actions were correct and effective, yes, but always final. The moral dilemma became clear when the battleships faced a choice about a sick woman who refused treatment. Her illness was serious, but she was scared of the unfamiliar methods. The battleships approached calmly but firmly and gestured for her to come. She hesitated, looking around at her family. The young doctor stepped forward, trying to speak with the woman, reassuring her. But the battleships did not wait. They moved in, lifting the woman gently but decisively. The young doctor realized she had no choice but to let them act. The woman's treatment was successful, her life saved, but the intervention left a lingering sense of unease. The young doctor understood that the battleship's methods, while effective, did not respect hesitation or consent. The village had been healed, but at the cost of individual choice. That evening, the young doctor sat in the square watching the villagers interact. Conversations were quieter than before. People looked to each other less and to the battleships more. They were stronger and healthier, but they were also beginning to rely completely on these extraordinary humans. Gratitude had become dependence and relief had become submission. She reflected on the events of the day. The battleships were remarkable, capable of saving lives with a speed and skill that no ordinary human could match. Yet their presence carried a weight that could not be ignored. They were protectors, yes, but also enforcers of order. The villagers had been healed, but their independence had been quietly diminished. As the sun set behind the hills, the battleships gathered once more. They did not speak, did not smile, and did not seek praise. Their work was done for the day, and their presence remained both a blessing and a silent reminder of power. The villagers returned to their homes, grateful but thoughtful. They had received life-saving aid, yet they also understood that their lives were now intertwined with beings whose power could not be challenged. The young doctor walked slowly through the village streets, thinking deeply. She knew the battleship's actions had saved countless lives, but she also wondered how long the villagers' reliance could continue without consequence. She understood that tomorrow would bring new tests, new moral questions, and perhaps new situations where the line between protection and control would become even clearer. Night fell over the village, quiet and reflective. The young doctor sat near the square looking at the stars above. She thought about the dual nature of the battleships, their power to heal and protect and their unyielding authority. The village had been transformed, and while the healing was undeniable, so was the subtle cost of their dependence. And deep inside, she knew that the challenges were far from over. The battleships had shown their strength, but the moral questions they brought would remain long after they left. The villagers would be healthier, safer, and stronger, but they would also carry the memory of beings whose methods were both miraculous and intimidating, leaving them to wonder about the true meaning of aid, power, and freedom. For now, the village slept under the watchful eyes of the human battleships. The day had been one of life-saving miracles, but also of lessons. Lessons about authority, choice, and the delicate balance between protection and control. And as the young doctor closed her eyes, she understood that tomorrow would test both the village and the battleships in ways they could not yet imagine. The morning air was cool and calm, a soft breeze moving through the village as the first light of the sun touched the rooftops. The villagers were awake early, but today the usual mixture of excitement and tension was different. There was a quiet understanding in the air. Something was about to change. The human battleships, who had become such a presence in the village, were preparing to leave. The young doctor walked through the village square, observing the battleships as they moved silently among the tents and patients one last time. Their work continued with the same precision and care, but now it had a finality to it, a sense that their mission here was ending. Villagers watched from their homes and doorways, some curious, some hesitant, and some with a heavy feeling of gratitude mixed with sorrow. Children were the first to notice. They ran to the battleships, waving shyly and holding out small gifts, flowers, a handful of fruit, or even a piece of cloth they had woven. The battleships received them with a calm, quiet presence. They did not smile, but they nodded, accepted the gifts, and moved on, acknowledging each child with a subtle gesture. It was a simple act, yet it carried weight. The children felt seen, even by being so extraordinary and different from themselves. The young doctor watched a mother bring her child, now fully recovered from a long-standing illness, to one of the battleships. The child hugged the battleship's leg carefully, as if feeling both the strength and the gentleness within the same being. The battleship responded by crouching slightly, allowing the child to hold on to them, a silent understanding passing between them. The mother wiped away tears quietly, realizing that life in the village had been saved in ways no ordinary medicine could have achieved. As the day progressed, the battleships began to pack their equipment and prepare for departure. The villagers gathered in the square, unsure whether to watch, to say goodbye, or simply to stay silent. The young doctor felt the weight of the moment. She understood that while the village had been healed physically, emotionally, and even socially in some ways, the presence of these extraordinary humans had also left a mark that could not be undone. Some villagers approached the doctor quietly, sharing their thoughts. "They saved my family," one elder said softly, "but I feel smaller somehow. Not weaker, but I realize we have been under their watch." Another villager added, "I am grateful, yes, but I am also afraid. What if we ever need help and they are not here?" The young doctor nodded, understanding completely. The battleships had given the village life and protection, but they had also changed it. Independence, Choice and human instinct had been replaced in part by reliance on beings far stronger and more capable than anyone could imagine. The village had been healed, but at the same time, it had been shaped by the presence of something almost divine in its precision and power. By late afternoon, the battleships lined up near the edge of the village where they had first arrived. Their vehicles were ready, packed neatly and waiting. The leader turned slowly to survey the village one last time, eyes scanning the people who had been their charge. There was a quiet dignity in the way they stood, almost like statues, yet their presence felt alive, protective and commanding all at once. The villagers approached hesitantly. Some bowed their heads, some held out small tokens, and some simply watched, unsure of what to say. The young doctor stepped forward, speaking on behalf of the village. "Thank you," she said softly, "for healing, for protection, and for everything you have done. We will never forget this." The leader nodded once, a simple gesture that carried weight beyond words. Then, without warning, the human battleships began to move toward their vehicles. They did not rush, and they did not look back. Their work in the village was done, and now it was time to leave. The young doctor noticed the mixed emotions among the villagers. Children waved, calling out goodbye in soft voices. Adults held their families close, feeling both relief and sorrow. Even the elders, who had seen much of life, could not hide their awe at the beings who had walked among them for a few short days and changed their lives forever. As the convoy began to leave, the village felt quieter than ever. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the square. The young doctor walked through the empty streets, observing the changes. The tents were still set up neatly, the supplies carefully arranged, and the village was healthier than it had been in years. Yet there was a sense of loss. Life would continue, but the extraordinary presence that had reshaped it was gone. She thought about the duality of the human battleships, the power to heal and protect, and the authority that came with it. The village had been saved, yes, but it had also been reminded that life could be influenced in ways beyond human understanding. Independence had been balanced with reliance, awe had been mixed with fear, and hope had come hand in hand with caution. By nightfall, the village was quiet. Families sat together in their homes, reflecting on the events of the past days. Children slept soundly, their illnesses cured, their energy renewed. Adults spoke softly of what they had seen, what they had learned, and what they hoped to remember. The young doctor remained outside for a while, staring at the stars above. She felt a mixture of gratitude, awe, and contemplation. The human battleships were gone, but their impact remained. The village had been healed physically, emotionally, and even socially, as people began to cooperate and care for one another more closely. But there was also a subtle lesson imprinted in everyone's minds. Power, when combined with knowledge and skill, could save lives, protect communities, and shape the world. But it must always be respected. The young doctor walked back to her small quarters, feeling the weight of responsibility. She knew the villagers would continue to thrive, but she also knew they would carry memories of beings who were far beyond ordinary humans. Those memories would shape the way they thought about help, strength, and the delicate balance between dependence and freedom. And so, the village slept peacefully under the stars, safe and healed, yet forever changed by the extraordinary presence that had walked among them for a brief, unforgettable time. The story of the day they expected medical aid, but received human battleships instead, would be told for generations, a story of healing, strength, awe, and the quiet reminder that some forms of help are far greater than anyone could imagine. The young doctor finally closed her eyes, feeling a sense of calm. She knew that the village would rebuild, grow, and thrive, carrying both the lessons and the gifts left behind by these remarkable beings. And somewhere deep in her heart, she understood that life in its most extraordinary moments could surprise, challenge, and change people in ways they could never have anticipated.